We're now about halfway into version 4, meaning we've had a lot of time with the new path, new characters, and most importantly, new enemies. And with all of the recent shill that's been going on, some people are starting to feel like only the shill teams even have a chance to perform well. But while there are certainly some fights that are more restrictive than others, Star Rail often gives you ways to circumvent these problems, so long as you learn the enemy mechanics. So then, I think it's important that we delve deeper into how to utilize enemy mechanics to our advantage, and discuss how it may impact team building. Now before we get into the details, I'd like to emphasize that this video is more of a continuation of a previous video that delved into skill and HSR, so it'd be best to check that out if you haven't already, especially considering this video builds upon many concepts established there. But back to the main topic, I'd say much of the reason why enemy mechanics hold so much importance is that it's often what dictates whether a matchup is favorable or unfavorable for a certain team. This is why older fights that barely have any mechanics are accessible to so many different teams, but newer fights with an abundance of mechanics can feel restrictive to a certain character or archetype. This type of system isn't new to the gacha space, and it's quite common for the design philosophy of enemies to become more intricate as these games age. Funnily enough, the best example of a modern gacha game that operates like that is Genshin Impact, as it's quite common for newer enemies to force you to interact with a mechanic, but restrict your means of doing so by requiring a certain reaction or element. However, where Star Rail differs is that when an archetype or a character is being shilled, it feels much more like a suggestion, not a restriction. To see what I mean, let's delve a little deeper into some of the newer enemies. Firstly, let's talk about Sparxicon, the first Elation shill boss, and one that's clearly meant to shill Sparxy at the time. Now beyond the fire weakness, this boss ends up shilling Sparxy through its main field and subfield mechanic, which locks one designated ally into a field with 3 enemies, and your teammates cannot directly help that character. However, if you're an Elation character, the Aha instance will target the enemies on the subfield, meaning that any Elation DPS can still gain assistance from their allies, while being able to utilize the buffs that your teammates on the main field can provide by hitting Sparxicon's monitors. Not to mention, once you're kicked out of the subfield, your team is given a free Aha instance, which is essentially Yao Guang's entire kit, just given as a free bonus. So yeah, it's pretty obvious to see that this is Elation's shill, and Elation will obviously have an easier time into this fight. But just because it's easier for Elation, doesn't mean that it's only accessible for Elation, as Sparxicon is arguably one of the easiest fights in the game, simply through the amount of characters that have a favorable matchup into her. And much of the reason why is that blast or AoE characters, that are ideally a hypercarry, do exceptionally well here. It's because Sparxicon is one of the few bosses that has multiple bodies with a shared HP pool, with the only other notable example being Banana Academics. Furthermore, the main field and subfield mechanic can be worked around very easily by having her target an ally that deals most of the damage, which is very simple in hypercarry setups. Because of these factors, DPS like Mighty, Anaxa, Castris, and especially Firefly do extremely well into this fight, and their best clears are often very similar to Elation runs. This is very important, since many of these characters fall under very different archetypes from Elation, and are comparatively far older teams. As such, if your investment on these teams are higher than your Elation teams, it's very likely that even if you have both, Elation may not be your best choice. I myself approve of that very concept, as my Firefly team has consistently outperformed my Elation team in this fight, and I'm certain there are many other accounts out there who experience the same thing. And Sparxicon is far from the only example, as very similar situations can arise from most of the newer bosses. For Illwish, much of the fight can be summed up to her summoning flowers, and receiving a vulnerability debuff once you've defeated 6 of them. And fortunately for us, nothing about the process of them being summoned, or her receiving the debuff, is gated by using Elation in any form. Instead, Elation is incentivized in this fight by the fact that the flowers provide punchline on death, which is very beneficial for Superwolf especially. But just like with Sparxicon, certain aspects of their mechanics provide favorable matchups for more than just the shield archetype. Most notably, the constant spawning of weak mobs is extremely strong for Zila, who is capable of even zero-cycling Illwish during the 4.2 Anomaly Arbitration King and Check fight. Of course, that comes with a caveat that you can efficiently manage Zila's resurgence, which is admittedly far easier said than done. However, this fight gives her ample opportunities to farm off the mobs, and then dump everything onto Illwish, leading to a difficult but manageable clear. Then you have E2 Firefly, who similarly benefits from the weak mobs by abusing them to get constant E2 procs. This fight is especially notable for her, because the flowers aren't spawned through an action from the boss, but instead from whoever Illwish marked. As such, even if Illwish is broken herself, the flowers will still spawn as long as the marked allies take a turn, which is extremely useful for E2 Firefly. Mind you, both of these characters face a typing disadvantage, and yet they can abuse what little mechanics this fight provides to compete with the shield archetypes. And lastly, we've got the newest boss, Graphia, a fight that mechanically doesn't even shield anything. And this is because the entire fight focuses on the debuff that she applies, requiring an exchange of SP and HP, possibly multiple times, to remove it from your characters. Then further into the fight, she spawns 2 enemies that reduce a portion of Graphia's own HP when defeated. So if your teams have blast or AoE damage, they can utilize these enemies to get free damage applied to Graphia. But the benefit is typically small enough to avoid focusing on them if you're already playing a single target team. So a lot of the strategy surrounding this fight centers on avoiding or working around the debuff, rather than a certain team or archetype gaining a resource only applicable to them. In that sense, you could argue that it shields Himiko Nova, since using an assist skill on the character that has been applied the debuff lets them avoid the mechanic. But unless your Himiko Nova is E2, there's still an element of luck involved considering you only have 1 assist skill use for teammates per Himiko turn. In a similar sense, you could argue it shills Superwolf's global passive, but that can only happen once in a fight, so it's not a direct counter unless we're speaking about zero cycle scenarios. And then as a general workaround, teams that have a surplus of leftover SP typically have an easier time managing the debuff if you get unlucky. As a result, the best clears against Graphia aren't really dictated by anything mechanically, besides their ability to manage a mostly single target fight. Because of this, the teams that perform the best here are Ashblade, Archer, and Himiko Nova, so they either excel in single target fights, or in the case of Himiko, have aspects of the fight that are advantageous for her. But the mechanics of enemies aren't the only factor that can influence team building, as there are a large number of notable interactions that stem from the kits of characters. In fact, many of these interactions are so advantageous for the character that it's beneficial to run them even if they don't typically fit into the team or fight. The biggest example of this would easily be E1 Tribute, as the damage increase that you gain from it in 5 target scenarios is very significant. This is because E1 Tribute can record the damage you've done on every target in the field, and draws 24% of it onto the target with the highest HP, which is typically the boss. As such, in fights like Nigador, Flame Reaver, Ill Wish, and the multiple other bosses that summon trash mobs that don't affect the main HP bar, it can allow you to utilize a portion of that wasted damage from the mobs onto the main target. In doing so, you increase your total effective damage onto the boss without attacking them directly. And then you've got a character like Castris, that directly translates HP fluctuation into energy for her ultimate. And because of this very unique way to acquire energy, she happens to benefit from a wider range of enemies. More specifically, aggressive enemies. Now it's important to note that an enemy being aggressive isn't a trait that's exclusive to bosses anymore, as the design of many newer elites has become more aggressive than bosses these days. The biggest example of this are the new Joy Ascendants, who are quite possibly the hardest hitting enemies throughout all of Plan Arcadia. As a result, keeping track of which bosses and elites appear in a fight can actually lead to tangible benefits for a Castris team, as these enemies result in a higher frequency of cast results than normal, leading to better performance. On the topic of HP fluctuation, we can also delve into Mortonak's Blade, and how he abuses one mechanic far more than any other character in the game, Corrosion. Now because Mortonak's Blade is our newest pseudo-sustain character, some people have been playing him in sustainless compositions, and I'm certain anyone who's done so has immediately noticed that managing his HP is far from a simple task, especially in combination with utilizing his enhanced ultimate. As a result, Blade won't be able to use his enhanced skill very often, and will need to forego using the enhanced ultimate at times just to make sure he can ult immediately after his countdown ends. But both of these things cripples his damage contribution quite significantly, not to mention his energy generation and attack frequency lowers as well. However, if Blade is afflicted with Corrosion, it's possible to use his enhanced skill without losing any HP. Now this is quite hard to pull off, especially since it's possible you can out-heal the Corrosion if you're hitting a large number of enemies, or hitting very frequently. But if you can control it correctly, Blade can fulfill his pseudo-sustain role while still outputting good damage, and high attack frequency, which is far more difficult to do without Corrosion. And while we're talking about damage control, I think there is no greater example of its impact than in Cyrene's teams with Mighty and Anaxa, as their burst damage profile allows for a multitude of favorable interactions. More specifically, the fact that the bulk of Anaxa and Mighty's damage in these teams is directly tied to the moment they receive Cyrene's ultimate buff, means that your damage window can be stored and dropped at any given moment. Because of this, bosses that debuff themselves at certain moments in the fight can be heavily abused by these two teams. bosses like Illwish, both renditions of Sam, Sparksicon, and quite literally every Apocalyptic Shadow fight, once you've broken them, provide opportunities that these teams can abuse. Mind you, these are just a few of the many examples out there, as it almost feels as though each character has a certain mechanic or interaction within their kit that allows them to excel in certain scenarios. Hence why the previous video regarding player skill made such an emphasis on learning how your characters work, as doing so could easily change the result of a fight. But unfortunately, not everything is as positive as they make it out to be, as there are many exceptions to what I've talked about. Now the main point I've tried to emphasize throughout this entire video is that Shill in Star Rail is more to incentivize certain characters or teams, not restrict you to them. This is the case because mechanics, character interactions, and overall knowledge of enemies can be abused to open the door to so many different solutions. However, with some bosses in the game, you are heavily restricted if you don't have the exact solution they are looking for. The first and most obvious example would be Pollux, an enemy that I've repeatedly stated to be the worst designed boss in this game. I won't delve into too much detail on why, as I've already done so in the past, but I'll summarize it by saying that Pollux forces you to run a healer. Now for the average clear, that isn't the worst restriction in the world, but for those who push themselves to reach good clears, possibly even zero cycling, this means you need the best healer, Hyacinth. And since Pollux doesn't provide any workaround, you need an ungodly amount of investment to even scratch Pollux without a healer, as they have an insanely high amount of damage reduction until you interact with their mechanic. And speaking about damage reduction, that brings us onto our next boss, Pom Pom. Now when I was going over the version 4 bosses, you may have noticed I intentionally skipped past Pom Pom, and that's because it follows in Pollux's footsteps of being an exception in enemy design. Now funnily enough, Pom Pom does things a little differently from Pollux, as it feels as though it's shilling a character that doesn't necessarily exist yet. To explain what I mean, we've got to discuss its main gimmick, Alloy Pommy. Now after a certain point in the fight, Pom Pom will give themselves 2 stacks of damage reduction, and give you an Alloy Pommy. And after you've generated 20 punchline, Alloy Pommy will receive an extra action that can remove 1 of Pom Pom's stacks. Now at face value, this is very obvious elation shill, and fairly egregious at that, considering the Alloy Pommy generates punchline very slowly without the help of another punchline generator, meaning you're basically not doing damage for a large portion of the fight. However, Pom Pom specifically wants someone who generates a lot of punchline, and can do so relatively frequently, which are 2 requirements that nobody can fulfill well. And the closest character we've got is Sparksy, and while she definitely can generate a lot of punchline, doing it quickly is definitely not her strong suit, at least in a sub-DPS role. Then as a main DPS, she does act far quicker, mostly through Sparkle's action advancing, but faces another problem, the fact that Alloy Pommy has an extra action. Because of this, their action is queued up after Sparksy's enhanced basic attack, meaning that it doesn't benefit from the damage reduction being wiped. Luckily, most of Sparksy's damage comes from her relation skill, but it's still a noticeable portion of her damage getting ignored, which is quite sad for a boss that's meant to shill her. But there is a solution to the attack frequency problem that helps both playstyles, and it's Sparks EC2. And honestly, it seems as though this fight is exclusively shilling E2 Sparksy, and is screwing everyone else over. Because of this, many people have called Pom Pom an AV black hole, or the second Pollux, and other things of that nature, which are all accurate in their own right. But unlike with Pollux, even with the shill team, this fight is still miserable, and it's further proof that they should never give damage reduction to an enemy, and definitely shouldn't tie the process of removing it to a restricting mechanic. And on the topic of restrictions, there happens to be an entire game mode centered on doing exactly that, Apocalyptic Shadow. Now when we're discussing the importance of enemy mechanics in Star Rail, Apocalyptic Shadow stands as the single biggest anomaly, since enemy design, blessings, and interactions are entirely reworked when they're put in this game mode. There are countless examples of this, like how the Fei Xiao fight got reworked to shill Dot, how Nikador now shills SP intensive teams like Archer or Sparksy, and so on. But most importantly, Apocalyptic Shadow deviates from the other endgame modes and how it feels like a puzzle that needs to be solved. You just need to bring the correct pieces. Now fortunately for us, recently the number of pieces that correctly fit into the puzzle for these fights has drastically increased, and the higher frequency of free characters helps a lot in this regard. However, these fights heavily push you to use specific teams or characters, and punishes you severely for not doing so by locking you out of interacting with mechanics or blessings. As a result, This game mode is the biggest offender when it comes to restrictiveness, and is typically one of the hardest to consistently get high scores, without owning a wide range of options. Now it's important to note that most of this restrictiveness is felt for those who seek out the best scores, as the requirements needed to just strictly get a clear are low enough to widen the amount of viable pieces to put into the puzzle. But for those who seek out the best clears, especially for sub 150 AV runs, even high levels of vertical investment may not be enough to brute force these mechanics. With that being said, there is one character that deviates from everyone else in this game, and as a result, he cares far more about utilizing enemy mechanics, with that character being Phainon. Now the very strange thing about Phainon is that within his transformation, he's entirely immune to any CC, on top of the fact that he's the only character that can directly manipulate the enemy's action value through his counter. It's for these two reasons, alongside some other quirks of his kit, that leads me to believe the skill within Phainon runs doesn't necessarily come from playing him well, but rather from understanding the mechanics of enemies and using them to his advantage. Furthermore, the intricacies surrounding his E1 and E2, and how your gameplay decisions shift once you've acquired them, adds a further layer of depth that can be abused in certain fights. The best example of something like this can be seen from his matchup against the Swarm Bug, as how you'd optimally play the fight likely deviates from your initial thought. First, let's get the obvious out of the way, which is that Phainon is predominantly a bounce DPS, since a large portion of his meteor damage is bounce. I think a lesson that most owners of bounce DPS quickly learned is that bounce characters really don't want to be in AoE scenarios. This is especially the case if the DPS has a portion, or all, of their damage that is evenly distributed amongst all enemies, which Phainon does have. So with this knowledge in mind, your initial thought when playing Phainon into the bug would be to try and use your meteor after the bugs are dead, or before they've spawned. Furthermore, you'd also probably spawn the bugs as little as possible, to keep the fight mostly single target, and avoid using his counter because of that. However, because of his E1 and E2, it's actually wiser to spawn the bugs as much as possible, and to even use the meteor when all of the bugs are present. And much of the reason why stems from the fact that you want to use these smaller bugs to debuff the main bug, and more importantly, abuse them to farm additional actions, countering the bug to get 5 Scourge stacks per turn, using those additional stacks to get another meteor, killing the bugs to continue stacking his E1, and using these additional meteors to farm more extra turns from his E2. All of these decisions end up benefiting each other, and they all stem from Phainon taking advantage of an enemy mechanic that would otherwise work against him. But that's not the only way he does things, as it can also be used to remove the mechanics of an enemy entirely. This is especially noticeable with Ill Wish and Graphia, as both the mechanics stem from a debuff that Phainon completely ignores. As such, Ill Wish's flowers never ends up spawning in her fight, and Graphia's SP and HP loss gimmick is never encountered. Because of this, Phainon reduces these fights to a simple single target brawl, with very few mechanics to work with. Now with Graphia, there's a bit more complexity, as she does spawn 2 enemies later into the fight that Phainon can abuse to farm more Scourge stacks, much like with the Swarm Bug. But the depth here compared to any other team is far lower. And just like before, he too is susceptible to some exceptions during certain fights. Though a lot of his problems stem from his biggest strength, the fact that he bypasses some mechanics. Because of this, he can't choose to drop all of his damage at specific moments like a Nax or a Mighty in their Sereni comps, or throw Hyacinth in his team to make Pollux easier, or utilize the flowers from Ill Wish to farm Scourge stacks. Essentially, there are many mechanics and ways to play the game that he locks himself out of, making some things harder than they otherwise would have been. And that's not even mentioning the fact that he really wants his E2 to start turning things around. This is why understanding the mechanics and movesets of enemies in this game is very important for Phainon, disproportionately so in comparison to any other character, which is also why evaluating his skill level is so difficult to do. And now we can tackle the main question of the video. Do enemy mechanics matter in HSR? And the answer is quite similar to that of the skill video, which is that it certainly does, but the impact changes heavily depending on what we're talking about. Who are you specifically fighting? Are you bringing the intended team into the fight? How invested are your teams? All of these questions and many more can impact how much it matters and can dictate what team would be your best solution. So being mindful of how enemies work, and more importantly, being aware of how your characters can utilize or bypass their mechanics can be the defining factor that leads to a better clear. But depending on your goals and investment, some people may already be satisfied with their clear speeds, so learning the mechanics of an enemy may not hold enough impact to be worth their time. So I'd encourage you to think about the results of your clears, and ask yourselves whether it matters to you. I'm glad I got the chance to delve back into this topic, as skill in Star Rail is always debated, especially when it's compared to the other Hoyo games, and I'd love to add more to the discussion. Also, I'd like to thank Neophyte for the video idea, as I initially planned on bringing this all up during the skill video, but quickly realized it was far too large a topic to fit in there. So I'm happy that I could complete my take on how skill impacts things in Star Rail, and I'm curious about other people's thoughts on the matter. Anyways though, bye-bye!